Water rippled around her as she clutched her arms across her chest, half hidden among the reeds, her hair streaming like black fire against the sunlight, and shame burned hotter than the cold water biting her skin. From the shore came cruel laughter, 3 town men waving the bright scraps of her dress high above their heads like a trophy, their boots thudding on the rocks as they jeered at her helplessness. "Swim for it, Apache girl!" one shouted, and another hurled her torn sash into the dust, their voices echoing across the clear blue lake, as though the whole valley had turned to mock her. She pressed herself deeper into the water, teeth chattering not from cold but from fury, and then she saw him, a lone rider cresting the hill, his horse dark against the blazing sky, a cowboy whose shadow stretched long as he slowed at the edge of the shore. Desperation clawed at her throat, pride warring with terror, but her voice broke free, raw and pleading. "They stole my clothes, cowboy. Save me!" The words cracked across the water, silencing even the jeers for an instant. The rider's gaze swept the scene, the men sneering on the bank, the woman half drowned in humiliation, and without hesitation he swung down from the saddle, his boots striking the earth like a challenge. The nearest man barked a laugh. "What's it to you, stranger? Just an Indian girl, no more than a game." The cowboy's hand slid deliberately to the coat slung over his saddle, his jaw tightening, his eyes cold steel. He strode forward, the ground trembling under his boots, and the men faltered, their smirks shrinking as they felt the weight of a man who did not jest. Elias Redfeather's voice lingered on the wind. "I have carried tales where cruelty laughed loud, but louder still was the silence that fell when a man stood against it." The cowboy shrugged off his coat, kneeling at the shore, his voice low but fierce as he extended it toward her. "Come out," he said. "You've nothing to fear while I'm here." Her breath caught, shame and hope colliding, and though her legs trembled under the water, she reached for the coat, her fingers brushing the fabric like salvation itself. The men cursed, backing away, their game undone, and in that moment the lake that had been her prison turned into the first witness of her rescue. The coat fell heavy across her shoulders as he wrapped it firmly around her, its warmth swallowing the trembling of her body. And for the first time since the cruel laughter began, she felt hidden, not as prey but as a woman shielded. The men on the bank shifted uneasily, their grins faltering as the cowboy rose to his full height, broad shoulders framed by the rising dust of his horse behind him. "You've had your fun," he said evenly, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Now it's over." One of them spat into the dirt, trying to recover his sneer. "She's nothing but an Apache stray. We were just teaching her place." Fury flared hot in her chest, shame twining with rage. But before she could speak, the cowboy's hand dropped to the revolver at his hip, his gaze locked on them with such steady defiance that the air itself seemed to stiffen. "Her place," he said slowly, "is not for you to decide." Elias Redfeather's voice threaded into the moment like a steady drumbeat. The frontier was full of men who thought cruelty was power, but every so often one would appear who understood that true power lay in mercy and in the courage to stand for it. The ringleader barked a laugh to mask his unease, but the sound came out cracked, thin against the weight of silence. "You'd fight us over a squaw?" The cowboy's eyes narrowed, his voice low enough that the wind nearly carried it away. "I don't fight over women," he said, drawing the words like iron. "I fight for them." The line struck her harder than the cold water ever had, and her knees weakened beneath the coat he had draped around her, the trembling in her chest shifting from fear to something rawer, deeper. The men glanced at one another, the challenge clear, and though one muttered a curse, none dared step forward under the shadow of his gaze. Finally, with forced bravado, the ringleader tossed the scrap of her torn sash into the dirt, and spat again. "Keep your prize, cowboy, but she won't thank you for long." Their retreat was clumsy, boots scraping against rock, their cruelty folding into cowardice as they mounted their horses and rode off, leaving only dust and the echo of their mockery behind. She stood rooted on the shore, clutching the coat tighter, her lips trembling as she tried to form the words that burned in her chest but found only silence, for the man beside her had already spoken louder than she ever could. Her legs quivered as she stepped from the water, the coat heavy around her frame, clinging damply to her skin, and shame clutched her throat tighter than the chill ever could, for though the men had fled, their laughter lingered like a scar across the morning air. She wanted to vanish back beneath the lake rather than walk barefoot across the rocks. Yet the cowboy stood steady beside her, his horse shifting patiently, as if it too understood the weight of her humiliation. "Come," he said quietly, offering his hand, and though every instinct told her not to trust, her trembling fingers reached out, brushing his calloused palm, and he lifted her lightly into the saddle as if she weighed no more than breath. The coat slipped wider across her shoulders, covering the last trace of her shame, and she pressed it tighter, her heartbeat hammering with confusion. She whispered, almost to herself, "You don't even know me." But he mounted behind her, steady arms guiding the reins, his voice calm. "I know enough." The horse moved forward, hooves crunching against stone, carrying them up from the lakeshore into the winding trail where pine shadows swallowed the sound of their departure. Elias Redfeather's voice lingered over the path like a hush carried on wind. I have known rides where silence spoke louder than words, and in that silence 2 souls began to find one another. She gripped the coat at her throat, trying to still her shivers, though it was not cold now but the fire of being seen so bare and yet not mocked. "Why risk yourself?" she asked suddenly, the words spilling rough from her lips. "They'll come back. They always do." His arms shifted just enough to steady her in the saddle, his tone low but unshaken. "Because no one should be left in the water alone." Her breath caught, tears burning against her eyes. And she turned her face away toward the trees, unwilling to let him see how his words pierced deeper than cruelty ever had. The coat smelled of leather and smoke, the scent of his life, and as the trail opened toward a cabin nestled against the hillside, her chest tightened with a question she could not voice, whether this man was stranger, savior, or the beginning of something her heart had longed for yet never dared hope. The cabin stood small but solid against the hillside, smoke curling faintly from its chimney, and when he pushed the door open, the scent of cedar and old firewood drifted into the crisp air, wrapping her in a warmth that the lake had stolen. She hesitated on the threshold, her bare feet raw from stone, the coat clutched tight, her body still quaking with the memory of laughter. But he stepped aside with quiet patience, letting her choose whether to cross. Inside, the single room glowed with the orange light of a hearth where embers still smoldered, a kettle hanging low, and rough-hewn shelves lined with tin cups and jars of flour. Simple as the man who lived there. She drew in a shaky breath and entered, the floor creaking under her weight. And for the first time since her shame began, she felt the air soften, though she dared not yet trust its promise. He set his hat on a peg, knelt by the fire, and stirred the coals until sparks leapt, throwing shadows across the walls. "Sit," he said, not as command but as invitation, and she lowered herself slowly to a bench, the coat sliding down her shoulders to reveal the edge of her damp hair. Her hands twisted in the fabric, knuckles white, and she whispered, "They meant to strip me of more than cloth. They wanted to take my name." He looked at her then, eyes catching the firelight, and his voice came steady, unflinching. "A name isn't theirs to take." Elias Redfeather's voice curled gently through the glow, like a story carried on smoke. The cruel will steal what they can hold, but no man has hands strong enough to grasp the dignity of a woman who refuses to let it die. She bowed her head, her breath hitching as tears threatened, and for a moment the silence pressed heavy, broken only by the crack of wood. Then he rose, took a wool blanket from the bed, and laid it beside her, the gesture simple yet as weighty as his stand at the lake. "Rest," he said. "You'll need strength when they come again." Her gaze snapped up, fear tightening her chest. "You think they'll return?" His jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek shadowed by the flicker of fire. "Cruelty never ends on its own," he murmured. "It must be answered." Her fingers gripped the coat tighter, torn between dread and the unspoken promise in his words, that she would not have to face that answer alone. "They won't stop," he said quietly as he placed another log on the fire, his voice carrying the weight of certainty rather than fear, and she shivered through the cabin's warmth wrapped around her like a shield. "Those men weren't just drunks looking for sport. They follow someone who wants more than cruelty." She drew the coat tighter around her chest, her pulse quickening. "Who?" she whispered, her lips trembling with the question she dreaded to hear. He turned toward her, eyes shadowed by the flicker of the flames, and his jaw tightened. "Jared Claiborne, sheriff's son. Thinks he owns this valley." The name struck her like a blow, for she had heard it murmured in the town. Claiborne, the family who claimed law by blood, their reach long and their pride cruel. She rose to her feet, panic surging. "Then I am lost," she cried, her voice breaking. "If it is his will, they will hunt me until I crawl." Her knees buckled, but he caught her by the arms, his grip firm but steady, pulling her upright before she fell. "You are not lost," he said sharply, eyes blazing. "Not while I breathe." Elias Redfeather's voice echoed through the moment like the roll of distant thunder. "There are men who wear law like a mask, using it to wound, and there are others who carry no badge but wield a truer justice, born from mercy and iron will." She stared at him, her breath ragged, the truth of his words warring with the terror clawing at her chest. "Why risk yourself against a sheriff's son?" she whispered, tears spilling freely now. His lips pressed into a grim line, and for a moment he seemed to wrestle with something deep inside him before he answered. "Because I've seen what happens when good men stay silent. My wife paid that price with her life." The words dropped heavy into the silence, her gasp sharp as she realized the depth of his scars. He released her arms gently, stepping back as though bearing his grief had cost him more than any wound. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her heart breaking with both pity and fear. For now she saw him not as untouchable savior, but as a man bound to the same pain that haunted her. The coat weighed heavier on her shoulders, not as shame, but as the first thread of shared sorrow. And she knew in that moment that their bond had already begun to weave into something neither of them could walk away from. Boots pounded across the wooden boards of the saloon porch as the doors burst open, the raucous laughter inside cutting short when 3 riders shoved their way in, spurs jangling, dust still clinging to their coats. The cowboy's hand shot to the woman's arm, where she sat beside him at the corner table, her eyes wide as shadows of the men stretched across the floorboards. "There she is," one of them crowed, voice thick with liquor and cruelty. "The lake girl who needed saving." The room rippled with uneasy chuckles, patrons shifting in their chairs, eager to watch but unwilling to interfere. She gripped his coat tighter around her shoulders, the humiliation washing over her fresh, and her voice cracked. "Please, not here." But he rose slowly, his chair scraping loud against the floor, and every eye turned to him. His hand rested on the table, steady, the veins in his forearm taut as rope. "Enough," he said, voice low but sharp as broken glass. The tallest of Claiborne's men sneered, stepping closer, his pistol swinging loosely at his side. "Sheriff's son says she's fair sport, so unless you think you're above the law." The cowboy moved before the words had finished, his boot striking the floorboards like a hammer as he stepped between her and them. Broad shoulders casting her in shadow. "Law," he growled. "The law you follow is rot, and I'll not bow to it." Elias Redfeather's voice coiled through the tense silence like smoke across dying embers. In a saloon where whiskey blurred courage, true bravery was often measured not by who drew first, but by who refused to yield. Gasps rippled as the cowboy's hand hovered near his revolver, not yet drawn, but steady, certain. "Tell Jared Claiborne," he said, voice cutting like thunder. "If he wants to break her, he'll have to break me first." The words struck the air harder than gunfire. And for a heartbeat, even the gamblers at the back fell still, their cards forgotten in trembling hands. The Apache woman's breath shook, her chest tight, because no man had ever spoken her defense so boldly, and shame warred with something far more dangerous: hope. The riders cursed under their breath, retreating a step, unwilling to draw steel against a man who looked as if he had already buried too many foes. One spat near the door, snarling, "Claiborne'll hear of this!" And then they were gone, leaving the saloon heavy with silence, broken only by the hitch of her sob as she realized his fight had become hers too. Her hands trembled so fiercely she nearly tore the seams of the coat as she clutched it tighter, her breath uneven, tears cutting hot trails down her cheeks, while the echoes of their retreat still clung to the saloon walls. "They will not stop," she whispered, voice breaking like dry twigs beneath a boot, and her eyes searched his as though he might already hold the answer she dreaded. "Men like Claiborne do not forgive shame. He will hunt me until I kneel, until there is nothing left of me but silence." The weight of her confession filled the room heavier than the scent of whiskey and smoke. And patrons who had once gawked now turned their eyes away, as if the truth of her fear was too much for them to carry. The cowboy's gaze did not waver. He stepped closer, lowering himself until his broad frame no longer towered but steadied, his voice quiet yet unyielding. "Then don't kneel," he said simply. "Not to him. Not to anyone." A sob broke from her throat, bitter and sharp. "You don't understand. If I stay, they will drag you into their war. You'll lose everything, like I have." His jaw tightened, the scar on his cheek shadowed by lamplight, and his answer came like iron striking stone. "I've already lost everything that mattered once. I won't let it happen again, not while I have a choice." Elias Redfeather's voice wove through the silence like a hymn carried in dust. "Love doesn't chain itself to certainty. It walks into risk and calls it worth." She shook her head, pressing her palm to her chest where her heart pounded against the coat's fabric, as if it might break through. "But I am no gift," she cried. "I am ruin. Any man who stands near me is doomed to fall." His hand lifted then, not to seize, but to hover at her shoulder, steady, offering without demand. "Then leave," he said softly. "If you believe that, you can walk away tonight. I won't hold you." Her breath froze, the words striking her harder than any threat, for they were not the chains she expected, but freedom itself. Tears blurred her sight, and her knees weakened. But beneath the coat's weight she felt something stir, fragile yet undeniable. The seed of trust, planted not in protection alone, but in the mercy of choice. The first light of dawn spilled pale and gold across the ridgeline, brushing the cabin roof with fire, while mist clung low in the valley, and the cry of a hawk carried sharp through the morning air. She stood at the doorway wrapped in his coat, her bare feet on the cool wood planks, staring at the horse tethered near the fence as though it were already waiting to carry her away. Behind her, the cabin crackled with the low hiss of a rekindled fire, the smell of coffee drifting through the single room, simple, steady, and warm. She clutched the coat tighter. Heart warring with itself, every instinct urged her to flee before Claiborne's men came with chains or worse, yet every breath of this place whispered belonging, a home her soul had never known. The cowboy stepped out beside her, hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the horizon as though he expected riders to crest the ridge at any moment. "The trail is open," he said evenly, nodding toward the east. "If you ride now, you'll be gone before Claiborne stirs from his bed." She turned her head sharply, pain lancing through her chest, because his voice carried no command, only permission. "You would let me leave?" she whispered. Disbelief thick in her throat. He met her gaze, steady as stone. "I told you last night. No chains. If you stay, it will be your choice. If you go, you'll take my blessing with you." Elias Redfeather's voice slipped into the dawn air like a prayer whispered to the rising sun. Freedom weighs heavier than iron, but in its weight a soul learns whether it was made to run or to root. Tears blurred her vision, and she turned away, staring at the horse again, the temptation fierce. She imagined the road unspooling before her, empty and endless, free of Claiborne's reach, but also free of the man who had stood in front of her shame and made it his own. Her lips parted, the whisper escaping unbidden. "I don't want to be alone again." His hand settled lightly at her back, warm through the coat, and the simple contact steadied her more than words. "Then don't," he said. Her heart hammered as the choice crystallized, and for the first time she realized she wasn't bound to fear anymore. The decision was hers, and hers alone. "So this is where you've been hiding her," Jared Claiborne's voice boomed from the yard, sharp and venomous as a whip crack, and the Apache woman froze in the doorway, the coat clutched to her chest, as riders fanned out behind him in a half-circle of dust and malice. The cowboy stepped forward without hesitation, his boots striking the porch hard, and the boards groaned under his weight as he planted himself squarely between her and the gathering. Claiborne sat tall in his saddle, hat tipped back, a cruel smile cutting across his face as his eyes raked over her with unashamed possession. "You think you can keep her?" he spat, voice dripping with mockery. "She belongs to this town's laughter, not to you. You can't wash shame clean with your coat." Her breath hitched, fury surging with the sting of his words, but before she could speak, the cowboy's voice cut sharp and steady. "She doesn't belong to laughter. She belongs to herself." Gasps rippled through the riders, a few shifting uneasily in their saddles, but Claiborne only laughed, the sound grating. Big words from a man standing against law and blood. Elias Redfeather's voice slid through the moment like wind across canyon stone. When law was wielded by tyranny, the only justice worth remembering came from men who dared to stand in its path. Claiborne dismounted, boots striking the dirt, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver as he sneered. "Step aside, cowboy, or I'll put you in the ground and take her back to where she belongs." Fear clenched her chest, and for an instant she felt her knees weaken, but then she heard the low timbre of the man before her, unwavering. "Draw if you must," the cowboy said, eyes like steel, "but if you lay a hand on her, you'll never rise again." Silence fell heavy over the yard, broken only by the restless snort of a horse. Her tears burned hot. But they were not of shame now, they were of awe, for he had taken her burden and made it his stand. And in that breath she understood the truth. She was not hidden behind him. She was standing with him. Her hand lifted, trembling but sure, and she laid it against his back, not as plea but as vow, the coat slipping open to reveal her face unbowed, daring the crowd to witness that she would not kneel again. Her tears shimmered in the dawn light as the yard held its breath, every rider frozen by the sight of her hand pressed against his back. Her chin lifted not in shame, but in defiance. And for the first time since the lake, she felt the weight of eyes without crumbling beneath them. Jared Claiborne's sneer faltered, fury tightening his face as he spat. "You think a coat makes her decent? She'll always be a joke, a stain on this town." The cowboy's hand moved slow and steady, shrugging the coat from his shoulders, and he turned to face her, the world narrowing to the circle of dust around them. His voice carried like iron hammered on an anvil. "It isn't a coat that makes her decent. It's the woman inside it." He draped it around her once more, pulling it firm across her shoulders, and the act struck harder than any bullet, an unshakable vow delivered before the eyes of every man present. Elias Redfeather's voice threaded through the hush like a hymn etched in stone. A single gesture, witnessed in the open, can overturn 100 cruelties whispered in the dark. The Apache woman's heart surged, pride swelling where shame once lived, and when she met his gaze, she saw no pity, only a fierce certainty that bound her stronger than chains ever could. The riders shifted uneasily, Claiborne's authority crumbling in the silence until even his men refused to meet his eyes. Rage twisted his mouth, but he saw then what they all did, that the power he had tried to wield through laughter and cruelty had been shattered by a coat and a vow. He cursed, mounted his horse, and rode off in a storm of dust, his men trailing behind like shadows burned away by light. The yard exhaled, the stillness breaking, and she turned fully toward the cowboy, clutching the coat close, not as a shield, but as a treasure. Her voice trembled, but it was steady enough to carry. "You gave me back what they stole." His lips curved into the faintest smile, one forged of pain and promise. "No," he said softly. "You carried it all along. I only helped you see it." Her tears spilled free then, but they were warm, cleansing, and as his arms wrapped around her, steady and sure, the coat binding them together, she knew this love would outlast every whisper, every cruelty, every shadow cast across the frontier. For what had begun in water and shame ended in fire and pride, a story that would not die with them, but live in the telling long after the dust had settled. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you had stood at that lake with only a coat to cover you, would you have hidden in shame or worn it as your pride?